It's a pleasure to be here. My program co-chair, John Kerry at Dartmouth College, actually thought about hopping on a plane to try to get down here to do this with me, and at the last minute had some family things that he needed to attend to, but he sends his good wishes. Institutions matter, and Bing Powell is one of them. A member of the... Oh, it's going to get better. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a Guggenheim Fellow, Woodrow Wilson Prize winner, editor of the American Political Science Review, vice president and immediate past president of the American Political Science Association, Bing Powell has shaped the study of politics in important ways. We honor him today for his service to the association and to political science as a discipline. And I feel privileged to be given these moments to convey the deep appreciation of so many colleagues and students and faculty working in our field. So Bing Powell is an institution in our world, but that wasn't always the case. His story, which mimics so many of the stories in this room, is the tale of a young person with an imaginative mind, engaged by the politics around him, and curious enough to let the people standing next to him influence his future. It was 1963, and politics was everywhere. A young senior at Princeton University, Bing began his research career by writing a senior thesis titled "The Law as an Instrument of Social Change: Case Studies in School Desegregation." In his own words, Bing described it as purely qualitative. But what a topic, and what a question in 1963 for a young person to think about 9 years after Brown, and only 1 year after James Meredith needed 500 US Marshals to escort him to Ole Miss so he could enroll in his first class. Bing's knack for studying things that matter to the world had an early start. And it was this penchant that led him to graduate studies at Stanford, where he got to work with Gabriel Allman and Sid Verba. And it was then that his interest switched to comparative politics. Along the way, he also traded his qualitative methods for a more data-driven approach, a switch that he attributes mostly to spending time with fellow graduate student Norman Nye. A lot of things he could have taken away from that relationship, and that's probably the best one. So it wasn't until he handed in his dissertation that Bing completed his first comparative politics research project, which included a survey of citizens in Hallein, Austria, which he fielded himself, elite interviews, and a good dose of archival work. The discipline had changed Bing in the 4 years since Princeton, and as he entered the profession, he would change it in return. Bing went on to build and become an institution at the University of Rochester, where he excelled at teaching and training scores of undergraduates and graduate students, and was honored separately by the university with distinguished teaching awards for both. He also served his department as Director of Graduate Studies and Department Chair. In 2012, if we had been able to hold the meeting, the Comparative Politics section of the APSA would have awarded the first Powell Graduate Mentoring Award, a prize that the association will now celebrate in honor of Bing's dedication to graduate student training, the fruits of which are easily appreciated by the long list of distinguished Powell students shaping the field of comparative institutions and democratic processes today, 2 of whom we just heard from. And the thing that makes Bing a great mentor to graduate students is what also makes him a great scholar. In the words of Bing's former colleague and my program co-chair, John Kerry, there's a quiet passion for democracy in Bing's work that flows from a transparency of design, method, and argument. People may disagree with Bing's conclusions, John said, but everyone trusts his work. We simply believe him. But there's one more important element to the work that takes us right back to Princeton University in 1963 and Bing's work on school desegregation. Bing measures outcomes that matter, political violence and death, for example, or whether the center of gravity in government lines up with the ideological center of gravity among citizens. The importance of these things is self-evident. and to be able to demonstrate that the rules of political competition systematically affect these outcomes is a profound contribution to knowledge. I'll finish where I started. Institutions matter, and Bing Powell matters. Please join me now in honoring the contributions and dedicated career of a political science institution. Please welcome to the podium Bing Powell.
Thanks, Anne. Thank you, Lynn, those kind words. And I'm sorry again about the hurricane. And I wanted to thank Larry and Chris and the various sponsors who are our hosts who sponsored this splendid idea for this conference in the commemorating the 50 years of Miller and Stokes. And when I heard about it, I wanted to come, and I appreciate giving me the opportunity to do that and to present at long last my presidential address, which Hurricane Isaac sabotaged. So let me do that. And it's a mark of how much I've already learned from this conference that my presidential address begins formally. The 19th century invention of representative government transformed our understanding of democracy. I know, of course, from this morning's early paper how far off that was and how much that already went into our understanding of representative government before the 19th century. Nonetheless, in a comparative cross-national sense, it more or less holds. And this invention of representative government made it possible to envision government by the people in nation states rather than confined to small direct assemblies. Competitive elections could select representative policymakers and induce them to govern responsively. Through both theoretical and empirical analysis, political science has devoted a great deal of energy to understanding the processes that connect citizens and policymakers in representative democracies. A perennial question for theory and practice has been which electoral institutions create this connection most successfully. A more specific form of this very large question has juxtaposed two of the most common forms of election rules: single-member district, both plurality and majority rules, versus the various rules in the family known as proportional representation. These investigations have clarified many aspects of the consequences of election rules and opened the way to understanding many more. One of those consequences has been the fit between the ideological preferences of the citizens and the ideological commitments of their governments. Democratic theory assumes that successful democracy will somehow create close ideological congruence. Until recently, there was a fairly clear-cut consensus as to which type of election rules generated closer ideological congruence. But as is not unusual in the world of politics, the clearly emergent pattern has become less clear, forcing a reconsideration of underlying theory and the emergence of a more encompassing theory, one that takes account of critical contextual conditions, hence my title, in making revised explanations and predictions is the basis of my address today. So, let's see if I can make this work. So this is where we're going. Let's say a little bit about the general circumstance about when theories fail, and a little bit about the topic then of ideological congruence and election rules, and some theoretical ideas about that, and then the empirical record, and then move to the issue of context that I want to talk about in terms of particularly the issue of the polarization of the party system, and then some remarks on context itself as a step toward explanation. So let me say a word about theories. So it happens to all of us in political science research that sometimes we have wonderful general theory or broad generalization, and it turns out to disappear, either when it's followed over time or when we move across countries or even sometimes a different region in the same country. And we may have a broad pattern of association. It may be even reliably observed and grounded, supported by a field experiment, plausibly explained with reasonably general theory, seemingly applicable to a variety of situations, and then It seems to fade away as we follow it, or it doesn't work as we move across nations. And this is disconcerting for a variety of reasons. It undermines our confidence in our observations, in our theories, even our type of explanation. And it limits our ability to perform when we're asked, occasionally, in that rare but exciting opportunity, to give advice to policymakers, as many political scientists have been doing in dealing with the elites designing new legislative bodies and institutions after the Arab Spring. Of course, this is frustrating, and it leads some of us to despair of developing general theories in political science. I want to offer a take on this problem that's more optimistic than just referring to the inherent unpredictability of human affairs or to a commitment to purely local and temporary explanation. My take is that we can get a lot of leverage on this problem by looking for aspects of the local context that shape and condition the working of our theories. And this becomes a good reason for building our generalizations and explanations on well-grounded theories of causal mechanisms, because the theory itself can direct our attention to features of the context that can change the working of relationships. Of course, there's no substitute, especially for givers of advice, for deep knowledge of local conditions. But there's vast numbers of unique features in any situation, and the trick is to know which ones are relevant and which ones are not. In principle, and sometimes in practice, we can restate our theoretical expectations as conditional on specific contextual features. That is, those features are integrated into the theory itself, allowing more specific context-conditioned explanations. So I want to offer you an example of this from my own work, but let me first illustrate the general principle with one of the best-known theories in comparative politics, which even this audience may have heard of, Duverger's law. So Duverger's law, of course, asserts that a particular type of election rule, legislative elections by single-member district, first-past-the-post rules, which are the ones we're familiar with in the United States, Britain, Canada, Jamaica, India, is linked to two-party systems. Another very common family of election rules, proportional representation, is strongly associated with multi-party systems. And depending on just how we measure two-party systems, Duverger's law does have some supportive evidence as we look at election rules and legislative party configurations in the experienced democracies across countries and time. Consider, for example, the introduction of proportional representation in New Zealand after 1996, which was followed by a change from legislatures dominated by two-party politics to ones with multiple parties and coalition governments. Recent work by Rob Moser and Ethan Shiner introduces lovely additional implications by showing fewer parties competing in the single-member district parts of legislatures in mixed systems, such as Germany, than in the PR part of the very same legislatures. Yet there's lots of exceptions, and elections in newer democracies, especially those with larger numbers of independent, non-party candidates, seem particularly different than the familiar Duverger pattern. Moser and Shiner draw particularly on Gary Cox's theoretical explication of the logic of Duverger to identify features of local contexts that would be expected to deviate from Duverger's law. Brian Crisp and his colleagues at Washington University have made a similar contextual argument in their cross-national analysis of wasted votes. Duverger himself identified two theoretical processes, which those of you who've read it will recall. He called a mechanical effect of the election laws, which advantages locally larger parties and underrepresents smaller ones that fail to carry individual districts, and what Duverger called a psychological effect, which pointed to strategic behavior of voters in defecting from parties whom they liked, but whom were expected to be unable to win. The interaction of these two effects leads to expectations about the number of competing parties, at least at the district level. Cox's analysis points out that the strategic effect element in Duverger's law depends on, among other things, widely shared information and expectations about parties' chances of victories. It also depends on voters having well-developed preference orderings among the parties and voters being oriented to immediate electoral victory, not long-term position building. These assumptions about information and time frame also apply to party activists and financial supporters. A clear implication of Cox's explication of Duverger's law is that we should not expect to find fewer parties competing in SMD electoral districts in the conditions of new democracies without electoral experience, especially if elections are not dominated by party candidates. Moser and Shiner find exactly that pattern in contrasting numbers of parties competing in the SMD versus PR parts of legislative elections in new versus established democracies. Crisp and his colleagues find something similar examining wasted votes. So expanding our empirical predictions to take account of local context, in this case lack of common information about the prospects of various new parties and new democracy, we can explain when and where we expect Duverger's law to follow and when and where we do not. Now, my own experience with the need to take account of local context involves another consequence of election laws, the representativeness of national governments in parliamentary systems, especially the form of representation that we call ideological congruence. So ideological congruence involves the fit between the preferences of the citizens and the committed policy positions of their representatives. Normative theorizing about democracy implies that competitive elections should systematically create a close connection between citizens and their policymakers. Because of its special normative status as the position that can defeat any other in a straight vote, the position of the median citizen has particular significance. Good ideological congruence implies minimizing this distance. Of course, there are various complexities here. One of them, obviously, is that the normative assumption about the preferred role of the median voter, and we've already had some discussion about this, not to mention the empirical investigation of ideological congruence, depends on whether or not we can effectively understand political discourse as a one-dimensional issue space. Maybe we can talk about how plausible that assumption is. We'll get into it a little bit in the measurement discussion. Another complexity involves measurement in the sense of how to compare the position of the citizens, even median citizens, to the committed policy positions of the representatives, who are, of course, far more sophisticated and involved than the average citizens. And if memory serves, by the way, Miller and Stokes have a lovely discussion about that in their original 1963 APSR article. Very aware of this problem. Anyway, various scholars investigating it have taken a variety of approaches to comparing citizens and their representatives. I'll spare you a lot of the details about this and just concentrate on two of the most widely used approaches. One of them comes out of the famous Manifestos project, which looks at the policy positions taken by political parties in their formal statements during election campaigns. The statements in their manifestos, which correspond to what Americans call party platforms. The percentages of the manifestos devoted to different policy positions can be used to estimate the position of the parties on a left-right scale that has similar meanings in different countries. With the aid of some heroic assumptions, the party choices of the voters can be used to estimate the citizen median on that same left-right scale. Again, we could talk afterwards about what's involved in these assumptions. Another popular approach is to use the perceptions of citizens to rate the average perceived positions of the political parties and the governments that are composed of them on a left-right scale, and then compare these to citizens' rating of their own positions. The wonderful Comparative Study of Electoral Systems project has made these ratings available across many countries in elections in the past 15 years. Now up to, I think, about 82 elections have been covered. Each of these approaches, and some others, have various comparative advantages and disadvantages, and its strong advocates and critics. The assumptions involved in the Manifesto project, in terms of taking numbers of party commitments and adding up which ones are on the left and which ones are on the right to get a net position, and then estimating the citizen position. There's all sorts of complexities and ways you can go astray. On the other hand, using the citizens involves problems of projection and rationalization and citizen information and ignorance, estimating and how plausible that is. Instead of taking a position on this, I've rather tried to use both approaches and generate similar results using each approach, figuring if these different methods come up with the same general findings, the findings must be relatively robust. This, I must say, has been easy in a way for me psychologically, since most of my earlier work on this problem used yet a different approach, comparing expert placements of parties to citizen self-placements, which has its own limitations and weaknesses. Table 1 shows some ideological congruence results from some countries covered by the CSES Module 2 research program. These are expressed as different distances on a 10-point scale. The distance between the parties in the the government as perceived by the average citizen in that country, and the distance between that on a 10-point scale, and the position of the self-placed median voter in the country. The larger the number, the less ideological congruence. As the median voter usually places himself or herself toward the center, the maximum possible value is usually around 5 on the 10-point scale. In these countries, as you can see, they range from very tiny 1.0 in Taiwan and 0.07 in Canada, where the citizens are basically placing the governing parties at almost exactly the position where they place themselves, to distances as far as around 2 in Australia, a little further than that in Portugal, and even further, almost at 3 in Hungary and over 3 in Poland. So in Poland, the government in 2001 is about 60% of the possible maximum distance away from the government. So there's a lot, so even though all of these countries are identified as electoral democracies by Freedom House, and none of the governments is quite as far away as possible, there aren't any 4s or 5 distances up here, there's a lot of variation in ideological congruence, which is what we'd like to understand, and understand what's the relationship between the election rules and these distances of ideological congruence. Now, with respect to the consequences of election laws for ideological congruence, we have some theoretical expectations, at least for the parliamentary democracies, which I'm going to concentrate on here. I'll spare you the review of the literature, but the general idea is based on 2 of the most widely discussed theories in comparative politics, Duverger's law, which I was talking about above, associating the election rules and the number of parties, and Anthony Downes's theory of party convergence in 2-party systems and non-convergence in multi-party systems. So here we've got the expectations under single-member districts shown at the top of, use the hang of this yet, the top of the figure, the single-member districts here. The expectations under Duverger's law, of course, is that the single-member district system will be associated with 2-party systems due to the combination of the mechanical advantages, particularly of the larger party, the plurality party, and strategic voter defection from the small parties. Downes's theory, of course, expects that the strategic elites in this 2-party dominated system will converge to the position of the median voter. With only 2-party dominated systems, then the plurality party should win a majority, and whichever of the large parties wins a majority, they're going to be close to the median voter. So the distance between the government formed by that party and the median voter is going to be quite small. So good ideological congruence coming out of our expectations from Duverger's law and Downes's theory as it applies to single-member district systems. In proportional representation, on the other hand, we expect low mechanical distortion, voters not defecting strategically, but rather voting to the closest party, and the parties then the elites acting strategically seek open niches in the citizen preference distribution, and you get a multi-party legislature that reflects the vote distribution of the citizens. Then we have to combine that with our theory about, of course, how we're going to form majority governments, since mostly these PR elections do not result in single-party majorities. And we have, as we've already been talking about, quite a lot of theory about government formation and coalition formation in multi-party parliamentary systems. And what we expect basically is that the government will be formed of some combination of the median party, the plurality party, and some coalition partners. It's not necessarily both the median and plurality party in the same government, although that may happen, but about 80% of the coalition governments involve the median party, as indeed was consistent with George and Lanny's results that they just showed earlier from their 3 countries. And about 80% of all coalition governments have the plurality party in the legislature in the government. So we have some pretty good expectations about what sort of parties should be forming these governments. Now, notice, the point I want to emphasize here is that the pathways in this figure connecting the election laws, their 2 main variants, and ideological congruence, both of these pathways lead us to expect fairly good ideological congruence. In the single-member district systems, the nature of the two parties created according to Duverger's law and Downsian competition will create a majority government that's close to the median voter. And in the PR systems, we'll have multiple parties reflecting the vote distribution of the citizens in the legislature. And then the strategies of coalition formation will form a government that has within it at least the median party, so it'll be connected to the median citizen by that connection. So we get good ideological congruence predicted if the theoretical mechanisms work correctly, perhaps even better theoretically, good causal congruence under single-member districts. But the causal paths are quite different under the two types of election rules. So even though we're, in both cases, getting good ideological congruence, the mechanisms by getting there, in terms of the parties involved and the process of electoral competition, is actually quite different. Eventually, we have to complicate this a bit more, as I was mentioning earlier, and add some additional features of context, such as the potential for fraud and violence or lack of common expectations, as I was discussing before. And I didn't show them here, but they can weaken or alter, of course, Duverger's law and our expectations. In the 1990s and early 2000s, various studies by a variety of scholars, including, but certainly not only me, including a research team I wasn't even aware of until they started publishing, using several methodologies for measuring ideological congruence, found consistently the same thing in the developed parliamentary democracies. They found that on average, PR election systems were associated with better ideological congruence than the SMD electoral systems. The consistent PR advantage seemed to be due to the erratic results of the Duverger-Downs mechanisms under single-member districts. Despite the apparent theoretical advantage of single-member districts that you might expect from these two pathways, the empirical results gave consistent advantage to proportional representation. This led to various explanations, typically focusing on the greater stringency of the theoretical conditions for single-member districts and government-citizen congruence. These studies were eventually based on the full post-war experience from 1945 to the mid-1990s in the developed democracies. Then, just when it seemed that we had a nice empirical generalization and be developing its theoretical underpinnings more completely, came a study in 2006 by Andre Blay and Marc Baudet using a new data source, the Comparative Study of Electoral Systems program, which began in the late 1990s, and you saw in Table 1, which found no significant difference between ideological congruence in the SMD and PR systems. The work was soon replicated, and although initial suspicion fell on the different measurement methods, it became pretty apparent that there had been a distinct change in the level of ideological congruence in the SMD systems after the mid-1990s. The level of congruence in the PR systems remained roughly at the same level, with perhaps some improvement, but not nearly as much as in the SMD systems. How inconvenient of the world to disrupt our nice research results with some ugly new facts. You'll not be surprised, given my framing of this talk, that I have a candidate for a variable feature of the political context that can account for the change in the consequences of election rules after roughly the mid-1990s. What I'm looking for is a variable that fits our theoretical understanding of the causal mechanisms we've already been exploring and that operates in the same way in a variety of places and times and that shapes local context in a way that conditions the election law mechanisms. My candidate is a variable that we already knew affect various aspects of voter and elite behavior, such as the degree to which voters take account of ideological differences as they make party choices and the stability of parliamentary coalition governments, namely the ideological polarization of the party system. So, by ideological polarization, I mean the degree to which the parties are spread across the political spectrum, whatever the content of that spectrum in a given country. In a low polarization system, the parties, at least the larger parties, are grouped toward the political center. In a system with greater polarization, the parties are spread apart. This can be measured in a lot of ways, but conveniently by just the variance of the parties' ideological positions, weighted by the size of the parties. We would expect that higher levels of party system polarization make close ideological congruence more difficult. Lower levels of party system polarization would make close ideological congruence easier. And we expect that this operates as a contextual or conditioning effect on the election law consequences. Namely, at low levels of polarization, any set of election rules should generate good ideological congruence. At high levels of polarization, any set of election rules will have difficulty, but the effects can be particularly sharp under SMD rules. We can see why we expect these effects with a revised version of Figure 1, showing how the polarization conditions the working of the causal mechanisms in both the SMD and PR systems. At the top, we see the working, again, as we had it sketched out before, in the SMD systems. And we still expect Duverger's law to hold and to be two-party dominated systems. But here, because of the polarization context, the strategic elites resist strategic party convergence to the median. Strongly polarized political parties will resist convergence, Downes's expectations will be confounded, and the plurality party that wins the majority will be distant from the citizen median. Plurality party majority forms a government by itself typically, and that government is then distant from the citizen median in a direct, almost mechanical way. In the PR systems, again, we expect multi-party competition. Strategic voters vote for the closest party. Strategic elites seek open niches. As it's a polarized system, the voters are spread further apart, and the parties that they vote for are spread further apart. So we get a polarized legislature in terms of the parties in the legislature. Still, no majority government, so it has to be coalition formation. Going to be difficult with polarized party systems, and all the parties are going to be somewhat further, by definition of a polarized party system, from the median. So we're going to get a government. The median party will still be in there 80% of the time, pulling it somewhat toward the center, but it should be somewhat further from the median voter. In Figure 3, you can see how this played out in a particular circumstance of changing polarization in Britain in the early 1950s. At the top of the line here, we see the parties in 1950, the 100-point scale. This is drawn from the Manifesto data converted to a 100-point scale, and which is the way they've drawn it up. Unfortunately, to your right, to my left, is the left side of the ideological spectrum. The party in gray is the winning party in the election. The parties in white did not win. The height of the bars is roughly the percentage of votes that the parties won. You can see that the Labor Party, in the flush of post-World War II coming to power, right, creating the National Health Service, nationalizing the steel industry, building vast amounts of council housing and so forth, is putting into effect, is promising to put into effect, and is putting into effect a series of policies on the far left. Conservatives aren't as far right as they were back in 1945 when they were completely blindsided, have moved in toward the center, but the position of the median voter is actually at 68 on the moderate left, about between the two political parties. The parties are fairly polarized, about 20 points apart here, and the point about that is that whichever party wins the election is going to be fairly far from the median voter. Compare this to 1959, when the parties have converged on the position of the median voter. Labor has backed off a little bit. The Conservatives have seen the light and are promising to do all the popular parts of the Labor Party platform, except to do it better and more efficiently. The parties end up very close together, and whichever of the big parties win the election, it's going to be close to the median voter. By the way, this sort of thing, or really the previous election, the 55 election, is just exactly what Downes had in mind when he wrote Economic Theory of Democracy. There's a footnote in it that refers explicitly to the convergence of the two big British political parties, which he observed and which we can see in this generation from the Manifesto data. In Britain in 1983-2001, we see another tale of depolarization. So at the top, we have Britain in 1983. Here's Mrs. Thatcher's Conservatives on the far right, the Labour Party under Michael Foot. The Labour Party is taken over by its left wing is out here about where it was in the old the old days. So the parties have diverged very sharply. The median voter at this point is almost exactly at 50. The parties are separated by a huge distance, and whichever party wins the election is going to be very far from the median voter. The big parties are about 70 points apart. Compare this to Britain in 2001 after depolarization. Those of you who follow British politics know that in 1997, the Labour Party, tired of having its brains beaten in an election after election in the name of ideological purity, changed the party's name to New Labour, changed the Constitution, did away with the commitments to nationalizing industry in the Constitution, and accepted the sales of council housing to private owners and basically adopted the popular parts of the Thatcher Manifesto, changing the whole structure of British politics. Notice that the parties are close together. They've converged in that sense. They've converged to a different substantive place than they were back in the 1950s when they were converged at the social democratic left, and now they're converged slightly to the right of center. But the parties are together, and as in 1959, as Downs would have expected exactly, whichever party wins this election in 2001 is going to be very, very close to the median voter. So the conversion of this kind of a polarized or depolarized party distribution will create either sharp distances or very close convergence with the median voter, depending on the level of party system polarization. And it's even interesting to look at 1983 and engage in the thought experiment. Suppose we had proportional representation instead of single-member district situation in 1983. If we assume the voters would have voted the same way, which they almost certainly wouldn't have, so this is just a thought experiment, but it's kind of interesting to see the way it plays out. The largest party, Mrs. Thatcher's Conservatives, got just a little over 40% of the vote, which was converted into an absolute majority under the British single-member district rules, so they were able to completely dominate the political system and put Thatcher's far-right policy proposals into effect. If they had been fighting under proportional representation with these distributions, no party would have had a majority. It would have had to been forming some kind of a coalition government. Maybe the most likely coalition is between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, and that would have, the inclusion of the Liberal Democrats, the median party in the election, in the vote, the voted median party, in the government, would have pulled that government more toward the median. It still would have been off of it because the plurality party is so far away. You can't make polarization effects just go away by creating proportional representation. But the effects of the polarization are substantially softened under the coalition formation imperatives of the proportional representation. Whoops, sorry. Just a little ahead of myself here. So these two figures show how powerful is the resistance of party polarization to ideological congruence with the majoritarian party system. Now, favorite examples are all very well, but how general are these effects, and do they really account for the changing levels of ideological congruence in the SMD systems? The answer I was somewhat surprised to find is pretty general and surprisingly well. Although in all honesty, we have only a limited number of SMD systems, which limits our confidence a bit. Table 2 is an old-fashioned regression table, so I apologize for the younger generation for not having a gorgeous set of graphs to really express this. But I've been presenting data this way for 50 years, and it's hard to break these habits. So here we've got a conditional regression, and the dependent variable is the distance between the government and the median voter. So we want negative numbers. Smaller distance is good congruence. And we have here the effective number of parties and the polarization of the party systems both interacted with the nature of the election rules. To reassure us that this isn't a measurement problem, the first two columns, the data is done with the two different approaches to measuring government distance that I talked about earlier. On the far left, we have These are the so-called old democracies, which is basically mostly what the Manifesto data covered at that point. 327 elections there, and then in the column right next to it is the CSES study of 52 elections in these same countries. Further to the right, we've got the new democracies that are in CSES, and then the CS, all the democracies considered together. Now you'll recall, I'm actually embarrassed to even say this in this group, but I'll say it anyway just for completeness, that in this kind of interaction or conditional regression, the simple polarization coefficient is the effect of polarization under proportional representation, and then to get the effect under single-member districts, you add the two coefficients together. By the way, both of the Manifesto and CSES have been converted to 10-point scales, so we can reasonably compare the distances. Again, the methods are extremely different, but there's three takeaway points here. First, these two columns have pretty similar coefficients. Effective number of parties does nothing, whether in either SMD or proportional representation systems. Polarization is a problem under proportional representation. It's twice as big a problem under single-member districts. You add these two sets of coefficients together. And under SMD election rules, these are considered by themselves with zero polarization are insignificant, but actually negative, suggesting some advantage to SMD, as we might have expected theoretically under low polarization circumstances. So the first takeaway point is that the two measurement methods yield the same result, encouraging us about the robustness of the findings. And notice they're not just different measurement methods, but they're in somewhat different time periods, with the Manifesto data covering elections from the end of World War II to 2003, and CSES from 1997 to 2008. So we got same countries, but different time periods and different measurement results, giving us basically the same pattern of coefficients. Second, polarization clearly a problem, no matter what your type of system it is, but it's twice as big a problem under single-member districts as it is under proportional representation. Don't have any SMD systems on the new, mostly Eastern European democracies, but we still see polarization as a problem there in the polarization is a problem in the proportional representation systems, and when we add the two together, we find basically the same results. Polarization a problem everywhere, but twice as much of a problem under single-member districts. Now we can also use the Manifesto data to examine the aggregate patterns of ideological congruence over time in the SMD systems. So here, in this rather ugly table for which I apologize, we have the data broken down by decades, and in the first, this is just simple regression, ordinary least squares. The dependent variable is again the distance between the median voter and the government, and here we have broken down by time periods, and the reference time point is 1946 to 1955, the immediate post-war period. And we see, and we look at this on a decade basis, there's 2 decade periods that stand out as being significantly more congruent, less distance, than the others, and particularly with respect to the reference decade. One of them is the most recent one, which of course is just exactly what Blaise and Baudet pointed out in 2006 in this most recent time period. These are just the single-member district systems, but this is using the Manifesto data, not using the CSES that they used. We find more congruence, less distance in the most recent decade, and interestingly enough, in the Manifesto data, we find also significantly better congruence in this 1956 to 1965 period when Downs was writing his analysis in the Electoral theory of democracy. So, economic theory of democracy. In the interim period, the distances are about as distant, as incongruent as they were in the immediate post-war period. Now notice what happens the minute we put the polarization of the party system into the model. I put the effective number of parties, but it doesn't do anything here just with the 2 party system characteristics. And again, these are just the cases of single-member district countries and elections, 84 of them from the Manifesto data over this long time period. And so there's no need for interaction terms. These are just, this whole set is just the single member district cases. Notice the minute we put polarization into the system, not only is it incredibly statistically significant and powerful, but all the decade effects have gone away. Once we take account of the level of polarization, the cross-time effects go away, which is why we got into this in the first place. So we can so another way of describing this effect is in the most recent decade, the average polarization in the PR systems drops slightly from 1.8 to 1.6, but the average polarization in the SMD systems drops very sharply from 1.6 to 1.1. And because polarization has so much bigger impact in the SMD systems, the similar earlier levels created a high average incongruence in SMD. Now, that, as Downs would have expected, polarization is much less in the SMD systems. The two congruence outcomes are roughly equivalent. We can take just a further look at the causal, excuse me, do my Marco Rubio imitation here. So we can take a bit of a look at the causal mechanisms in proportional representation to see if what's going on is what we think it is. So here's the 229 proportional representation systems. This is the Manifesto data to maximize the number of cases that we're looking at. We see this in the first column we have just the number of parties and the polarization of the party system. So we see that indeed the dependent variable is the distance between the government and the median voter. Can see that the polarization is strong and statistically significant. And what's interesting here is then as we introduce more parties into the system, the parties that our theories about government coalition formation would expect us to be accounting for this connection between the government and the median voter, distance created by the polarization. We introduce first the plurality vote winner, and we introduce the distance of the median party and the distance of the government after the previous election, and then and notice that introducing these additional parties reduces the coefficient for polarization. And then when we take account of pre-election coalitions, it reduces the polarization coefficient even further, and it can actually even statistically significant as even the second largest vote winning party, which gets involved in some governing coalitions, and that reduces the polarization coefficient even more. Still just barely statistically significant at this point, but vastly reduced. So when we take account of these intervening political parties, we reduce the impact of polarization, suggesting that is indeed the causal mechanism, just as we expect. In the SMD systems, on the other hand, we've got roughly 80 SMD systems. A couple of things to note here. First, here's just our, in column 1, effective number of parties and party system polarization. Note that the polarization coefficient, I think it was 30 in the previous table, it's 54 here, almost twice as large here in the SMD systems. But we can reduce it to nothing just by taking account of the plurality vote winner. So again, we get this very simple, straightforward connection. It's the polarization and the way it affects the plurality vote winner that dominates government congruence in the SMD systems, as opposed to having to take all those different parties into account as we saw in the PR systems. And we can, that doesn't change the polarization result, we can up our percent of the explained variance a little bit by taking account of pre-election coalitions, which Australia and France have a bunch of, and occasionally a little different than the median, than the plurality party. Second vote winner means absolutely nothing in the single member district systems. So, main point I would have you take away from these two tables is that polarization is a problem for ideological congruence in both PR and SMD, as we said before, especially in SMD, but the causal mechanisms are different. They both have to do with government formation in the parliamentary systems, which operate roughly under the same formal rule, But in the PR cases, it's complex multi-party government formation process, whereas in the SMD systems, it's usually about the direct election of a legislative majority party or pre-election coalition. This exploration of the connections linking the election and the government outcome fits nicely with our expectation from the theories of government formation in parliamentary systems and helps us better to understand the process. I just want to say a little bit in conclusion about context more generally. So let us suppose, which I don't insist, that you accept that adding consideration of party system polarization as a conditioning or interactive feature of the local political context makes it possible to explain, both statistically and with respect to the causal mechanisms, and predict the consequences of election laws for ideological congruence more satisfactorily. Where does that leave us in the larger question of generally taking account of local context in theories in political science? I want to leave you with just a couple of thoughts about that issue. First, of course, identifying an important contextual factor and incorporating it into our theories as a conditioning variable may improve our explanation and may be quite satisfying, but it doesn't end our search for an adequate final explanation. We still want to know what accounts for party system polarization or adequate citizen information in our Duverger's law example or whatever. As usual in science, to answer one research question is to generate others. I've been doing some work on cross-national sources of party system polarization, looking at things like citizen ideological polarization, socioeconomic conditions, international ideological trends, and so forth. I found some glimmers and associations, but none of these really account for what happened in Britain in that example between the mid-1980s and late 1990s, which seems deeply bound up in relationships between the activists and the leaders within the political parties. This is both frustrating and fascinating, and in my view, it's inevitable as the process of science pushes both deeper and broader into the search for explanation. The second perspective goes in a little different direction and asks whether we can develop more general theories about context and election rules, and by extension, context and other generalizations in theories. At the moment, we have an APSA presidential task force looking into what political science knows about the variety of different consequences of adopting different election rules. This is going to be published by APSA, we hope, sometime in the next 6 months or so. One group is looking at the effects of local contexts. We've identified a couple of tantalizing ideas trying to get at this more generally. This is really in its infancy, but it seems so interesting I can't resist trying to share it a bit. And 2 points have emerged so far. One is that it may be constructive or instructive to build on Duverger's old idea of mechanical and strategic effects of election laws, as I did in the figures shown here. The mechanical effect has to do with the interaction between the votes and the rules if the latter are properly carried out. It has to, the former has to do, the mechanical effects has to do with the interaction between the votes and the rules if the latter are properly carried out. The strategic effects have to do with the way citizens or elite anticipates the mechanical effects and how that shapes the congruence by encouraging strategic defection from their first preferences. It looks to us as if the contextual condition that shapes the working of mechanical effects is mostly limited to the rule of law. In conditions of coercion and fraud, the mechanical effects may be unpredictable. I didn't put the potential coercive effects into the models that I showed here because they're not so prominent in the developed democracies such as these most of the time, but it's a key contextual condition as we take the theory more generally. The strategic, otherwise, in the absence of fraud and coercion, the mechanical effects work fairly predictably. The strategic effects, on the other hand, are much more sensitive to variations in citizens and elites' values and expectations, which often vary and are quite context dependent. Here we need to take account of information availability and common assumptions about party strength in the Duverger's law example, as well as for some consequences such as minority representation, features of the values, and other characteristics of citizens' strategic expectations. The second point is that some of the consequences of election laws are quite proximate to the election itself, while others, such as the consequences of election laws for minority representation or collective accountability or stable government, are more distant in time, logical sequence, or both, and they involve more causal linkages. In the case of these more distant consequences, then there's more opportunities for contextual effects to shape the various causal linkages, and hence the need to take more contextual conditions into account in both theory and explanation. Thus, the more causal linkages there are between the election rules and the consequences of interest to us, And the more of these linkages involve strategic processes, the more essential it is to take account of local conditions. This is just a preliminary reading of the evidence, not a well-grounded theory in its own right, but there seem to be exciting possibilities in the development of theories of contextual effects, and even more broadly, for political science theories that can give us more general and consistent explanations. Let me just conclude by saying that one of the exciting features of political science is its interaction between the great normative issues, such as representation and democracy. I assume that most of you are here because you find that exciting also. I've always found that converting these great normative issues into substantive research puzzles that can be studied objectively has been one of the fascinating challenges of political science research. In the past 2 decades, I've been wrestling with this puzzle of election rules and ideological congruence, trying to understand the theoretical basis of the electoral connection between citizens and policymakers. It seems a puzzle at the heart of representative democracy and a source of never-ending fascination. The changing nature of the empirical relationship between election rules and ideological congruence poses a familiar challenge to our ability to cope with the ever-changing world of politics. This happens all too frequently. Our theories are always being pushed by the need to respond to new and diverse conditions. Founding our generalizations on basic theories of mechanisms and processes hopefully makes it possible to rebuild them in ways that take account of critical features of local context, such as party system polarization in the example we explored here. Taking a theoretically based account of local context, in turn, enhances our understanding of where and when we expect the generalizations to hold. In my opinion, political science need not abandon the effort to find systematic answers to our empirical questions, and nor does it have to ignore the normative concerns that gave rise to those questions. Thank you.